Now we are going to discuss transplantation, and first we are going to discuss the important questions which are asked related to history of transplantation. So first, renal transplantation was done by Murray in which year? 1954. And the second important question, first liver transplantation was done by Stargell in which year? 1963. So see the important points related to history of transplantation. So first, renal transplantation. First, renal transplantation. Okay, and this first renal transplantation, it was done by Murray. In which particular year? In 1954. Why this is important? Because at that point of time, immunosuppressive agents were not discovered, not used. So he performed the transplantation and it was successful. Why? Because this transplantation was done between identical twins. So you have to remember, Murray performed first renal transplantation between identical twins. Identical twins. Okay. Now second question, first liver transplantation. And first liver transplantation was done by Stargell in 1963. It was done by Stargell in 1963. First pancreas transplantation was done by Kelly and Lilhay. First pancreas transplantation. Okay, and it was done by Kelly and Lilhay. In which year? In 1966. Kelly and Lilhay in 1966. And you have studied one chapter in CBSE board related to heart transplantation. So who performed first heart transplantation? Christian Barnard. Okay, so first heart transplantation. First heart transplantation, it was performed by Christian Barnard, and in which particular year? 1967. So it was performed by Christian Barnard and it was performed in 1967. Who performed first lung transplantation? Fritz Derom, and in which year? 1968. So see, first lung transplantation, and it was performed by Fritz Derom, and it was performed in which particular year? In 1968. We discussed who performed the first pancreatic transplantation, Kelly and Lilhay. Sutherland isolated islet cells from the pancreas. So Sutherland isolated islet cells from the pancreas and then he injected the islet cells into the portal vein. This is known as islet cell transplantation. So first islet cell transplantation was done by Sutherland, and in which particular year? 1974. So important point, who performed first islet cell transplantation, and it was performed by Sutherland. Okay, and in 1974. First heart and lung transplantation was performed by two surgeons, Reeds and Shumway, in which particular year? 1981. So first heart plus lung transplantation. First heart plus lung transplantation, and it was performed by two surgeons, Reeds and Shumway. And in which particular year? It was performed in 1981. First successful intestinal transplantation was performed by Deltz and colleagues. In which year? 1988. What you have to remember, the word successful. So first successful intestinal transplantation, right? And it was performed by Deltz and colleagues. And in which particular year? It was performed in 1988. So these are important one-liners which are frequently asked in NEET and DNB. Frequently asked. Okay. There is another one-liner question which is asked that Human Transplantation Act in India was passed in which year? 1994. So Human Transplantation Act in India, it was passed in 1994. Clear? One-liner questions. Now see, we are going to discuss graft rejection. Graft rejection is asked in pathology also, and it is asked in surgery also. So how many types of graft rejection are there? If patient is already having pre-formed antibodies, then after transplantation there is hyperacute rejection, and this hyperacute rejection occurs within minutes to hours. Second is acute, also known as cellular rejection. Why? Because it is T cell mediated and it occurs within 6 months of transplantation. And the most common cause of graft rejection, and that is chronic rejection, and that occurs after 6 months. So we are going to discuss the graft rejection. See the types. There are 3 types of graft rejection. Very, very important. So first, hyperacute rejection. Second is acute rejection, also known as acute cellular rejection. So this is also known as acute cellular rejection. And the third is chronic rejection. This is chronic rejection. Okay. The first question which is asked, and that is related to duration, right? So hyperacute, since there is presence of preformed antibodies, generally this rejection occurs within minutes to hours. It occurs within minutes to hours. Okay. Now what kind of antibodies? Some patients are having ABO incompatibility, so there is preformed ABO antibodies, and some patients are having anti-HLA antibodies. So it is because of preformed antibodies. It's because of preformed antibodies. And what kind of preformed antibodies? There is ABO blood group, okay, and anti-HLA antibodies. Now what is the problem? Because of these preformed antibodies inside the graft vessels, what's the problem? There is graft thrombosis. And if there is graft thrombosis, what happens? This rejection occurs within minutes to hours of transplantation. Now see, which transplantation is vulnerable to hyperacute rejection and which one is relatively resistant? So it's the renal transplantation which is vulnerable, and heart and liver transplantation are relatively resistant. So important point, renal transplantation, it's vulnerable to hyperacute rejection, it's vulnerable, and heart transplantation, liver transplantation, these are relatively resistant. This question is also asked. This is relatively resistant to hyperacute rejection. Now see here, acute cellular rejection, this occurs within 6 months, and chronic rejection, it occurs after 6 months. So this chronic rejection, it occurs after 6 months, right? Now usually within 6 months, generally most patients present with graft rejection within 5 to 30 days of transplantation. You have to remember 5 to 30 days. Here it is mentioned that this is acute cellular rejection. Okay, so this is cellular, so it is T cell mediated. So another important point, it is cellular rejection. So this is T cell dependent or T cell mediated. Clear? So see, acute cellular rejection is T cell dependent and it is characterized by mononuclear cell infiltration. Generally, this acute cellular rejection, it is usually reversible. it's usually reversible. The question which is frequently asked that out of hyperacute, acute and chronic rejection overall, which one is most commonly responsible for graft rejection? Question is asked that out of hyperacute, acute and chronic rejection, which one is most commonly responsible for graft failure? So it's the chronic rejection which is most commonly responsible for graft failure. What is the problem in chronic rejection here? Non-immune factors are responsible for pathogenesis. What is the pathogenesis? See, if this is the graft vessel, okay, graft artery, in this graft artery, what's the problem? There is myointimal proliferation. So if there is myointimal proliferation, what will happen? Can you see? There will be luminal narrowing, progressive luminal narrowing, and because of that, what will happen? There is ischemia leading to fibrosis. Okay, so problem, this is the overall, this is the most common cause of graft failure out of these three rejections. And which factors are responsible for pathogenesis here? It's the non-immune factor. So non-immune factors are responsible for pathogenesis. Okay, and one catchy word is there which you have to remember. What is the myointimal proliferation? So remember here, there is myointimal proliferation, and because of this myointimal proliferation in graft arteries, there is luminal narrowing, and because of that, there is ischemia and fibrosis. Clear? So these are the types of graft rejection. Now see, to prevent graft rejection, what we have to perform between donor and recipient, we have to perform the matching, and one of the matching is very important which is done, and that is HLA matching. Now see, there are characteristic manifestations of chronic graft rejection and which is dependent on the organ, and this is frequently asked both in pathology and in surgery. So see, what are the manifestations of chronic graft rejection? Manifestations of chronic graft rejection. This is very important. These are one-liner questions which are asked. So in the kidney, there is glomerular sclerosis and tubular atrophy. So what happens in pancreas? Both exocrine and endocrine system is affected. So what happens in pancreas? There is acinar loss, and simultaneously you can see that there is islet cell destruction. So there is acinar loss and islet cell destruction. In heart, what's the problem? There is accelerated coronary artery disease. And in liver, this question is frequently asked. In liver, there is vanishing bile duct syndrome. So chronic graft rejection is one of the cause of vanishing bile duct syndrome. And what happens in lungs? There is obliterative bronchiolitis. What? Obliterative bronchiolitis. So these are the manifestations of chronic graft rejection. Now see, to prevent these kinds of graft rejection, acute, hyperacute, chronic, what we have to go for? Matching between donor and the recipient. And one of the matching which is very important and performed to decrease the risk of rejection, that is HLA matching. HLA matching. Okay, so HLA matching, it's done to decrease the risk of rejection. It is done between donor and recipient. So see the most important HLA antigen for matching. Most important HLA antigens which are used for matching. Okay, so this is very important. This is HLA-DR. This is most important, followed by HLA-B, followed by HLA-A. Okay, so according to order of importance, the most important HLA antigen is HLA-DR, followed by HLA-B, followed by HLA-A. So how to remember? A, B, D. So the order in the reverse sequence. Most important, D, followed by B, followed by A. HLA matching has beneficial effect on certain transplantation, and generally there is no advantage of HLA matching. Now see in which transplantation HLA matching is having definitive beneficial effect. So if you see renal transplantation. In renal transplantation, there is small but definitive beneficial effect. So in renal transplantation, HLA matching is having small but definitive beneficial effect. Okay, definitive beneficial effect. But if you're talking the liver transplantation, for liver transplantation there is no advantage of HLA matching. So HLA matching does not confer any advantage. It does not confer any advantage for liver transplantation. So indirectly this is asked that in which particular transplantation HLA matching is usually not done. So for liver transplantation we are not going for HLA matching. If you're talking about heart transplantation, HLA matching is beneficial but it is not practicable. Why it is not practicable? First, that for heart transplantation there is relatively small recipient pool. And second, the permissible cold ischemic time is very less. See, the permissible optimal cold ischemic time for heart is less than 3 hours. So HLA matching is beneficial for heart transplantation, but it is not practicable. So third, for heart transplantation, HLA matching, it's beneficial, but it's not practicable. It's not practicable. So why it is not practicable? Because of small recipient pool. So relatively there is small recipient pool and there is short permissible cold ischemic time. Problem is that there is short permissible cold ischemic time. Okay, how much is the optimal cold ischemic time for heart? It is less than 3 hours. So I am repeating again, for renal transplantation there is small but definitive beneficial effect. It is not going to confer any advantage for liver transplantation too, so it's not done for liver transplantation. It is beneficial but not practicable for heart transplantation. Now see the important points related to HLA antigens. HLA antigens. We have read in both pathology and microbiology that HLA antigens are antigen recognition units, and these are highly polymorphic. And you know, this is the HLA antigen, these are the most common cause of graft rejection. We discussed hyperacute rejection. What was the cause? One, there is preformed antibodies either in the form of ABO or anti-HLA antibodies. So if patient is having anti-HLA antibodies, what kind of rejection will occur? If these antibodies are there, it can lead to hyperacute rejection. Now see, what are the various types of graft? First see, autograft. Okay, so what is this autograft? Here you can see if tissue from one site is transplanted to another. So in the same recipient, the tissue is transplanted from one side to another, and that's known as what? Autograft. If the transplantation is done between genetically identical donor, what do you mean by genetically identical donor? If identical twins, this situation is there. So if the transplantation is being done between identical twins, means genetically identical donor, so this is what? Isograft. So isograft is the transplantation between genetically identical donor or identical twins. There is one question which is frequently asked both in AIIMS and in NEET, that mother gives one of her kidney to the son who is having chronic renal failure. What kind of graft is this? So when graft is taken from the same species, graft is taken from individual of same species, this is known as allograft, also known as homograft. Okay, so whenever the graft is taken from individual of same species, this is allograft or homograft. And if the graft is taken from different species, and this is known as what? Xenograft, also known as heterograft. Xenograft or heterograft. So autograft, the graft is taken from one site and it is transplanted to another site or used at another site, autograft. If it is taken from genetically identical donor or identical twins, isograft. From the individual of same species, allograft. Sometimes they ask homograft, so you have to remember. And xenograft or heterograft, here the graft is taken from different species. Recently, they asked the types of xenograft. There is concordant xenograft and discordant xenograft. Concordant means the graft is taken from closely related species. Okay, so here the transplantation is done between closely related species. Like for human beings, old world monkeys or apes. Okay, like chimpanzee. So this is concordant. And if the graft is being taken from distantly related species or some unrelated species, right, that is discordant. Like whenever we are taking the graft from new world monkeys or from pig, so this is what? Discordant. So xenograft is further divided into concordant xenograft and discordant. Clear? This concordant xenograft means here graft is taken from closely related species. Closely related species. Clear? Like old world monkeys and apes, like chimpanzees. Clear? And discordant xenograft, here the graft is taken from distant related species, distant related or some divergent species or unrelated mammal. Divergent species or some unrelated mammal. Clear? So here the example is New World monkeys or some other mammal. Clear? So which one is the most commonly used discordant xenograft animal? It is the pig. Why? Because of availability and organ size. Clear? So discordant graft is generally taken from pig because of its availability and the organ size is similar between pig and human beings. So concordant and discordant xenograft. Sometimes in surgery related to transplantation, directly or indirectly, the questions are asked in relation to immunosuppressive agents. So see, what are the commonly used immunosuppressive agents which are asked frequently in the exams? So first, steroids. See the agents and their mechanism of action or principal mode of action. Clear? So what is the effect of steroids? Steroids are having widespread anti-inflammatory effect. Second, there is azathioprine and mycophenolic acid. Both of these are having similar mode of action and both of these are going to prevent lymphocyte proliferation. So azathioprine and mycophenolic acid, both of these are going to prevent lymphocyte proliferation. Important question, calcineurin inhibitors, which are the agents which are used? So we use cyclosporin and tacrolimus. And what's the mode of action? Both of these are going to block IL-2 gene transcription. Cyclosporin and tacrolimus, both of these are going to block IL-2 gene transcription. There are mTOR inhibitors. What is the full form of mTOR? Mammalian target of rapamycin. So mTOR inhibitors, mammalian target of rapamycin inhibitors, and the agent used is sirolimus. Now see the mechanism of action, it is similar. Here it is going to block IL-2 receptor signal transductions. So mTOR inhibitors sirolimus, it is going to block the IL-2 receptor signal transduction. Next is ALG, that is anti-lymphocyte globulin. So what is the catchy word? Anti-lymphocyte globulin. So this is anti-lymphocyte globulin, so that's why it is going to cause depletion and blockade of lymphocyte. Anti-lymphocyte globulin, depletion and blockade of lymphocytes. There is anti-CD25 monoclonal antibody. And what's the agent? It is basiliximab. Anti-CD25 monoclonal antibody, that is basiliximab, and it targets the activated T cells. Basiliximab targets the activated T cells. Then there is anti-CD52 monoclonal antibody. And what's the agent? This is alemtuzumab. And this alemtuzumab is going to cause depletion of lymphocytes. Clear? There is one agent which is used in lymphoma we discussed previously, that is anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, and the agent is rituximab. We used it in lymphoma. What is the mode of action? It is going to cause depletion of B lymphocytes. Depletion of B lymphocytes. And then there is CTLA4 immunoglobulin. Full form? C means cytotoxic T lymphocyte associated protein 4. Cytotoxic T lymphocyte associated protein 4 immunoglobulin. What are the names of agent? Belatacept and abatacept. So it is cytotoxic T lymphocyte associated protein 4. So it blocks T cell co-stimulation. Clear? Belatacept and abatacept. So these are the important immunosuppressive agents which are used in transplantation. Lots and lots of questions are asked related to these immunosuppressive agents, either related to their mechanism of action or related to their side effects. It's very easy to understand the complications of immunosuppression. See, our immunity is going to fight against microbes, pathogens, means bacteria, virus, fungi. So our immunity is going to fight against infections, and our immunity is going to fight against tumor cells or cancer cells. So if a patient is immunosuppressed or immunocompromised, what are the two most important complications? One is obviously infections, and the second is what? Increased risk of malignancy. So what are the complications of immunosuppression? First, increased risk of infections. So what happens after immunosuppression? There is increased risk of opportunistic infections, and these opportunistic infections are most commonly caused by viruses. Very important. So there is increased risk of opportunistic infections. Clear? And these opportunistic infections, these are mainly caused by viruses. Okay. Now see, sometimes there is donor derived infections and sometimes there is recipient derived infections. Clear? So which one is more common? If you see, recipient derived infections are more common than donor derived infections. Now see, the risk of bacterial infection is highest within first month of transplantation, and the risk of viral infection is highest within first 6 months of transplantation. So three important points. First, that recipient derived infections are more common than donor derived. Recipient derived infections, okay, are more common than donor derived infection, and there is increased risk of bacterial infection within first month. So bacterial infection, increased risk or high risk within first month, you have to remember, of transplantation. And what about viral infection? Increased risk or high risk of viral infection in first 6 months. In first 6 months of transplantation. In viral infection, what's the most common problem? This was direct question in AIIMS. The most common problem in viral infection, you must be knowing this organism is very hot, asked almost every year in AIIMS, and this is cytomegalovirus. So which one is the cytomegalovirus? Okay, now what is the mechanism? In certain patient already infection is there, so there is reactivation of latent virus. Why? Because of immunosuppression, and in some patients there is primary infection. So what's the mechanism? In certain patients there is reactivation of latent virus, latent infection, reactivation, and in certain patients there is primary infection. Okay, so any patient who is a high risk patient for cytomegalovirus infection, in all those high risk patients, what we give? Chemoprophylaxis. So for high risk patients we give chemoprophylaxis, right? So chemoprophylaxis is given to the patients who are high risk. And what should be done for community acquired infection? So for such patients we go for pre-transplant vaccination. So we go for pre-transplant vaccination. Okay, and this pre-transplant vaccination is done against community acquired infections, right? Community acquired infections. These are important points related to infections. Now see the points related to malignancy. There is increased risk of malignancy in the transplant recipient, and one of the commonly asked question, that most common malignancy seen in the patient who is having renal transplantation. So in a renal transplant recipient, what is the most common malignancy seen? And it is the skin malignancy. Which type of skin malignancy is the squamous cell carcinoma? Transplantation doesn't matter. Irrespective of type of transplantation, most common malignancy seen in transplant recipient is the skin malignancy. Which type? Squamous cell carcinoma. So second complication is malignancy. And the most common malignancy in transplant recipients, you have to remember this is skin cancer. It's the skin cancer. And which type? This is squamous cell carcinoma. Apart from skin cancer, there are other malignancies whose risk is increased. One is PTLD. PTLD, post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. Post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. And second is Kaposi sarcoma. So other malignancies whose risk is increased, one is PTLD and the second is Kaposi sarcoma. Okay. But the most common malignancy, that is skin cancer. There are certain non-immune side effects. These are directly or indirectly related to the side effects of drugs. Clear? So see, non-immune side effects, and these are dependent on the agents used. Now see, if we are using calcineurin inhibitors like cyclosporin, tacrolimus, what's the problem? The patients are prone to develop hypertension and chronic allograft nephropathy. So what? The patients are prone to develop hypertension and chronic allograft nephropathy with the use of which particular drug? With the use of calcineurin inhibitors like cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So calcineurin inhibitors. It is seen that after transplantation, certain patients are going to develop the diabetes mellitus. This is new onset diabetes mellitus after transplantation. and it is because of two agents, mainly because of two agents. One, you must be knowing, steroids, and the second is tacrolimus. So they can be new onset diabetes mellitus after transplantation. New onset diabetes mellitus after transplantation, and it is because of use of steroids or tacrolimus. Because of use of steroids or tacrolimus. Apart from this, there is increased risk of hyperlipidemia, anemia, and accelerated cardiovascular disease. So increased risk of hyperlipidemia, anemia, and accelerated cardiovascular disease. Accelerated cardiovascular disease. Okay, so you can see patient is having hyperlipidemia, accelerated cardiovascular disease. So what is the leading cause of death in transplant survivors? Suppose after transplantation patient is going to survive for 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. So what is the leading cause of death in transplant survivors? And that is the cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death. It's the leading cause of death in transplant survivors. In transplant survivors. Clear? So these are the complications of immunosuppression. There are certain complications which are frequently asked in relation to immunosuppression, and one of the frequently asked complication is cytomegalovirus infection. We discussed that among viral infections, the most common problem is cytomegalovirus, right? And cytomegalovirus infection, this is the most important clinical pathogen, and cytomegalovirus is the most important pathogen in clinical transplantation. So this is most important pathogen in clinical transplantation. In clinical transplantation. Okay, we discussed that generally viral infections are commonly seen within first 6 months of transplantation. This cytomegalovirus infection, this is generally seen after 30 to 50 days of transplantation. Clear? So usually occurs 30 to 50 days after transplantation. Now see, what are the clinical features? So just like any other viral infection, these patients are having fever, there is malaise, there is arthralgia, there is thrombocytopenia. So see, non-specific signs and symptoms. So fever, arthralgia, malaise, thrombocytopenia, these are non-specific. Generally, the questions related to CMV infection, which is in relation to immunosuppression or transplantation, it is given in the form of language. And there are certain pointers for the diagnosis of cytomegalovirus infection. So what are those pointers which are mentioned? These are interstitial pneumonia. So in the question you will find that there is interstitial pneumonia, or it is mentioned that patient developed enterocolitis, or sometimes there is evidence of disseminated disease. Clear? So these are the pointers of cytomegalovirus infection. What are the pointers? Interstitial pneumonia, enterocolitis, disseminated disease. So in a patient who is immunocompromised, apart from fever, arthralgia, malaise, thrombocytopenia, if these pointers are there, then we have to strongly suspect cytomegalovirus infection. So see how we are going to make the diagnosis. So there are certain confirmatory tests which are going to make the diagnosis. So what's the confirmatory test for diagnosis of cytomegalovirus infection? So invasive cytomegalovirus infection with histological evidence is confirmatory. If there is invasive cytomegalovirus infection with histological evidence, or there is positive cytomegalovirus culture from deep tissue specimen, so these are the confirmatory tests. Now, for the treatment, what is the agent which is used? So you must be knowing that we use IV ganciclovir. This IV ganciclovir is used both for prophylaxis as well as for the treatment, and you must be knowing that this is the mainstay of treatment for CMV infection. So for the treatment, we use IV ganciclovir. Clear? First important point, that it is used for both prophylaxis. It is used for both prophylaxis as well as for the treatment, right? And you must be knowing that this is the mainstay of treatment. Clear? So this is how we manage CMV infection. Next is BK virus, and you know that this BK virus belongs to polyoma virus family. So what's the family? It belongs to polyoma virus family. BK virus, generally it is associated with nephropathy, and after how many months of transplantation the nephropathy patient is going to develop the nephropathy? So it is generally seen after 1 to 4 months of transplantation. So it is associated with nephropathy, and this nephropathy typically occurs around 1 to 4 months after transplantation. 1 to 4 months after transplantation. How we can detect the increased level of BK virus replication? Increased level of BK virus replication can be detected by PCR of blood and urine. And if there is increased levels of BK virus replication, so it is predictive of pathology in renal transplantation. So see the problem, if there is increased levels of BK virus replication, okay, we can detect it by PCR of blood and urine. Clear? And if there is increased level of BK virus replication, it means it is predictive of pathology in renal transplantation. Okay, it means it is associated with pathological changes in the graft. Now see, if the patient is having urinary excretion of BK virus, so if the patient is having urinary excretion of BK virus, or patient is having BK viremia, okay, in these situations, what's the problem? There is increased risk of ureteric stricture, there is increased risk of nephropathy, and increased risk of generalized vasculopathy. So the patients who are having urinary excretion of BK virus and BK viremia, there is increased risk of ureteric strictures. There is development of nephropathy and generalized vasculopathy. So what kind of intervention should be done in this infection? So first, timely detection, and after timely detection we have to reduce the immunosuppression, and if it is done, we can decrease the graft loss from 90% to 10%. So the graft loss can be reduced from 90 to 10% by timely detection. So by timely detection and early reduction of immunosuppression. Early reduction of immunosuppression, what we can reduce the graft loss. Reduce the graft loss, can you see, from 90% to 10%. So the graft loss can be reduced from 90% to 10% if we are going to detect the disease timely, this viremia timely, and we are going to reduce the immunosuppressant. So early reduction of immunosuppression, timely detection can decrease the graft loss from 90% to 10%. Now another important condition which is asked frequently, that is PTLD, full form post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. And this disorder is associated with which virus? Epstein-Barr virus, and there should be presence of this virus in which particular cells? B cells. So generally this PTLD is associated with Epstein-Barr virus in B cells. Clear? Now see, PTLD, post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder, it is induced by enhanced immunosuppression. So it is induced by enhanced immunosuppression. And generally it is seen in the patients who have received more than one course of polyclonal ALG. The full form of ALG is anti-lymphocyte globulin, or monoclonal AKT3. Clear? So in which patients it is commonly seen? The patients who have received more than one course of polyclonal ALG. Okay, ALG means anti-lymphocyte globulin, or monoclonal AKT3. Monoclonal AKT3. Okay, so this is post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. Now see, what are the manifestations? What are the clinical features? These patients have fever. These patients have malaise. And it's a lymphoproliferative disorder. That's why these patients have what? Lymphadenopathy. And how we are going to make the diagnosis? There is lymphadenopathy, so we go for tissue biopsy. What are the clinical features? So the patients of PTLD, they have fever, there is malaise, and the important point that there is lymphadenopathy. Since it's a lymphoproliferative disorder, so there is lymphadenopathy. Okay, and how we are going to make the diagnosis? Diagnosis is done by tissue biopsy. So it's the lymphoproliferative disorder. That's why what? Biopsy. Now see, the treatment of PTLD depends on the type. If the patient is having polyclonal PTLD, we have to discontinue the immunosuppressants. And second, since it is caused by Epstein-Barr virus infection, we have to give antiviral agents. So we have to start antiviral treatment. So see how we are going to manage. The treatment depends on the type. So how we manage polyclonal PTLD, and how we manage monoclonal PTLD. Okay, so for polyclonal PTLD, first we discontinue the immunosuppressants which is responsible, and second, we have to start antiviral agents. So start antiviral therapy. Simple. And for monoclonal PTLD, since it's a lymphoproliferative disorder, so we give radiotherapy, we give chemotherapy, we can go for surgical excision. And there is one agent, which one? Monoclonal antibody against anti-CD20, which we discussed previously. And the agent is rituximab. So all these are the treatment options. So the treatment options for monoclonal PTLD, it's radiotherapy, it's chemotherapy, it's surgical resection, or use of rituximab. And we discussed what is this rituximab. This is monoclonal antibody against anti-CD20. Now we are going to discuss the organ donors. There are two kinds of donors. One is living donor and the second is diseased donor. See, if some family member is giving the organ, suppose one of the family member is giving one kidney or part of liver or one lobe of lung, so that family member is a living donor. What is the problem nowadays? There is exponential rise in the number of recipients, but the number of donors are limited. So we are harvesting organs from the donors who are either brain dead or the donors who are either circulatory dead, whose heart is not beating. Clear? So there are two categories of donors. First, there is dead or diseased donors. Dead or diseased donors. Okay, and the second is living donors. Clear? But see, living donors, here it is limited to donation of, you have seen, kidney, liver or lung lobe. Why? Because there are two kidney, so one kidney can be donated, part of liver can be donated, and one part of lung lobe can be donated. So it is limited, this living donors, this is limited to donation of kidney, liver and lung lobe. Kidney, liver and lung lobe. Okay. Dead or deceased donors, it is further divided into two types. One is known as DBD donors and the second is known as DCD donors. Now see the full form. DBD donors means donation after brain death. DBD, donation after brain death donors, and DCD, donation after circulatory death donors. So if there is brain death, what happens? Heart is still beating. So these are known as heart beating donors or brain dead donors. And if there is circulatory death, what happens? Heart is non-beating. So these are known as non-heart beating donors, also known as cardiac or circulatory dead donors. So first see the various names. DBD donors, it's also known as heart beating donors. And DCD donors, these are known as non-heart beating. So these are non-heart beating donors. Other name, donation after brain death donors. So these are brain dead donors. These are brain dead donors. And DCD donors, these are cardiac or circulatory dead donors. Cardiac or circulatory dead donors. Okay, one by one we are going to discuss. First we are going to discuss the DBD donors. Let me tell you, most diseased donor organs are harvested from DBD donors. So first we are going to discuss donation after brain death donors, DBD donors. And we discussed that most of diseased donor organs are harvested from DBD donors. These donors are having brain stem death, generally brain stem death. So after brain stem death, what? The organs are harvested. Now what is the problem here? See, these patients are having brain death. Okay, and what's the cause of this brain death? When there is brain injury. Now see, when this brain injury leads to irreversible loss of capacity of consciousness combined with irreversible loss of capacity for breathing. So there is brain death, it is caused by brain injury, and when brain injury leads to irreversible loss of capacity of consciousness combined with irreversible loss of capacity for breathing. So this leads to brain death or brainstem death, and most of the diseased donor organs are harvested from the patients who are having brainstem death. See the clinical testing of brainstem death. So there should be absence of cranial nerve reflexes. Absence of cranial nerve reflexes. Okay, so which reflexes we are going to check? See, it's the pupillary reflex, pharyngeal, which is also known as gag reflex, and tracheal, which is also known as cuff reflex, corneal reflex, and oculovestibular reflex. The other name of oculovestibular reflex is caloric reflex. So we are going to check these reflexes, and there should be absence of these reflexes. How to remember? The mnemonic is PCO. You can see here. So it is PCO. P, pupillary reflex, pharyngeal reflex, tracheal reflex, C is corneal reflex, O is oculovestibular or also known as caloric reflex. So there should be absence of cranial nerve reflexes. There should be absence of motor response. Absence of motor response. So absence of motor response to painful stimuli applied to head and face, and absence of motor response within the cranial nerve distribution to adequate stimulation. And the third is that there should be absence of spontaneous respiration. So in the patients of brainstem death, there should be absence of spontaneous respiration. Okay, this question is asked both in medicine and surgery. The criteria for brainstem death. So absence of cranial nerve reflexes, we discussed. Absence of motor response to painful stimuli applied to head and face and within the cranial nerve distribution to adequate stimulation, and there should be absence of spontaneous respiration. So this was the story of DBD donors. Now see the DCD donors. Okay, so donation after circulatory death donors. Because of rising demand of donors, nowadays we are taking the organs from DCD donors also, who are non-heart beating donors. And there is a classification. DCD donors are grouped according to Maastricht classification. This question was asked in NEET PG. So there are 5 categories of Maastricht classification. You have to remember the category and the description. So according to this Maastricht classification, there are 5 categories. What is category 1? Here, patient is dead on arrival at the hospital. So category 1 includes the donors who are dead at arrival to the hospital. In category 2, resuscitation was attempted but it was not successful. So resuscitation attempted without success. Category 3, most of the DCD donors belong to this category. Category 3, and here you can see awaiting cardiac arrest after withdrawal of support. So patient is already hospitalized and we are going to withdraw the support and we are waiting for the cardiac arrest. Category 4, here you can see that cardiac arrest while brain dead. So this patient is brain dead and in this brain dead cardiac arrest occurs. And what is category 5? Here there is cardiac arrest with unsuccessful resuscitation at hospital. Which question was asked in NEET PG? It was the category 3 and they asked the description. So most of the DCD donors belong to category 3. Most DCD donors belong to category 3. Now how to remember? The mnemonic is Dracula. Mnemonic is Dracula. D, dead on arrival at hospital. R, resuscitation attempted without success. A, awaiting cardiac arrest after withdrawal of support. C, cardiac arrest while brain dead. C, cardiac arrest and unsuccessful. U and L is included here. U and L. So unsuccessful resuscitation at hospital. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, and cardiac arrest with unsuccessful resuscitation at hospital, this is category 5. Now it is DCD donors are further divided into controlled donors and uncontrolled donors. What is controlled donors? Controlled donors include the donors in which death occurred after planned withdrawal of cardiorespiratory support. So out of these 5 categories, you can understand that in which 2 categories there was death after planned withdrawal. So if you see, it's the category 3 and category 4. Can you see? Awaiting cardiac arrest after withdrawal of support, and here patient was brain dead. In that patient, cardiac arrest occurred. So these 2 categories are included in controlled donors. Clear? And most of the DCD donors who are used, they are controlled donors. And rest of the categories are uncontrolled. So here you can see category 1, category 2, category 5. 1 to 5. Clear? These are uncontrolled donors. Uncontrolled. So here what's the problem? Warm ischemic time is longer. So in uncontrolled donors category 1 to 5, warm ischemic time is longer. That's why the graft survival is less predictable. Okay, so controlled donors include category 3 and category 4. Uncontrolled donors include category 1 to 5. Now imagine another situation. A patient who is having hepatic failure and this patient requires liver, right? There are no donors available, right? Suddenly you notice that there is a brain dead donor, but that patient is already having diseased liver. So that patient is either hepatitis C positive or hepatitis B core antibody positive. So recipient requires liver and the brain dead donor is having diseased liver. So whether we should use this diseased liver for the recipient or not, so we can use for saving the life of that patient. This group of donors are known as extended criteria donors, and generally we use extended criteria donors for kidney and liver transplantation. So see, extended criteria donors for kidney transplant and for liver transplant. So see, extended criteria donors, and this question was asked in All India, in NEET PG and in AIIMS. In short, it is known as ECD, extended criteria donors. Okay, so for kidney transplant, what are the criterias? And for liver transplant, which donors can be used? In the kidney transplant, if the age of donor is more than 60 years, considered as extended criteria donor, or if the age of donor is 50 to 59 years, along with that, there should be at least two of the following. What? The cause of death is CVA, cerebrovascular accident, or patient is having pre-existing hypertension, or the terminal serum creatinine, it's more than 1.5 milligram per deciliter. So out of these three, if two are present and the age of donor is 50 to 59 years, these are included in extended criteria donors for kidney transplant. For liver transplant, this was the question in AIIMS. If the patient is having mild to moderate steatosis, or patient is hepatitis C positive, or patient is hepatitis B core antibody positive, right? These donors can be used, but these donors are included in extended criteria donors. So this is important. You have to remember both ECD for kidney transplant and for liver transplant. Now we are going to discuss organ preservation solution. See, liver, pancreas and kidney. These three organs can be stored up to 2 days. How we can store these three organs up to 2 days? If we are going to flush these organs with University of Wisconsin solution, that is organ preservation solution, and if we are storing these organs at 0 to 5 degrees centigrade. So see, important point, three organs: liver, pancreas and kidney. Liver, pancreas and kidney. We can store these three organs up to 2 days. Clear? So how we can store it up to 2 days? If we are going to flush, so by flushing the organ with University of Wisconsin solution, in short it is known as UW solution, University of Wisconsin solution, and storing the organ at which temperature? 0 to 5 degrees centigrade. Clear? Lots of questions are asked related to this University of Wisconsin solution. What is the brand name of University of Wisconsin solution? It is Viaspan. So in detail we are going to discuss this University of Wisconsin solution. The brand name of University of Wisconsin solution is Viaspan. Okay, now see the composition. University of Wisconsin solution is having cationic composition, and generally there is increased potassium and there is low sodium. So there is high potassium and low sodium, and if you see the intracellular composition, it is similar. So why there is high potassium, low sodium? Because it mimics intracellular composition, and if it is similar to intracellular composition, there is minimum diffusion down the electrochemical gradient. So you should remember that this is the cationic solution and there is high potassium and low sodium, which mimics the intracellular composition. So see what is the composition of University of Wisconsin solution. Questions are asked related to the components and their action. So there is presence of lactobionate and raffinose, and these agents minimizes cell swelling. What's the use? These agents minimizes cell swelling. Okay. So there is presence of hydroxyethyl starch. What is the function? It is going to prevent extracellular space expansion. So it is used for prevention of extracellular space expansion. Okay, you must be knowing what's the function of glutathione. So glutathione is an antioxidant. So it acts as an antioxidant. Why there is allopurinol? This is free radical scavenger. So allopurinol is free radical scavenger. Okay. And what's the use of adenosine? It's the precursor of energy metabolism. So adenosine is the precursor of energy metabolism. Okay, so you have to remember the components and their function. So this is the composition of University of Wisconsin solution. For various organs, maximum and optimal cold storage timings are asked, and these are generally one-liner straight questions. So see the list. So first, for the kidney, what's the optimal storage time and what is the safe maximum storage time? The optimal storage time is less than 18 hours. Clear? And the safe maximum storage time, this is 36 hours for kidney. For liver, the optimal storage time is less than 12 hours. For liver, it's less than 12 hours. And the safe maximum storage time, this is 18 hours. Clear? For pancreas, it's less than 10 hours. And safe maximum storage time, it's just like liver, 18 hours. For small intestine, the optimal storage time is very low, and this is less than 4 hours. And safe maximum storage time, this is 6 hours. Optimal storage time, we discussed that it is least for the heart. And how much? It is least for the heart, and it's less than 3 hours. And the safe maximum storage timing is also least, and this is 6 hours. Clear? For lungs, it is similar to heart, less than 3 hours, and the safe maximum storage time is 8 hours. So if you see, both optimal and safe maximum storage timing, it is maximum, both are maximum for kidney. Optimal is less than 18 and the safe maximum storage time is 36 hours, and both are least or minimum for heart. So it's maximum for kidney, minimum for heart, and these two questions are frequently asked. So you have to remember optimal storage time and safe maximum storage time for these organs.